What was the very short marriage like between Lady Jane Grey, the tragic 9 Days Queen, and her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley? So over the years, their marriage has been depicted as something quite romantic, something tragic and ill-fated, and we saw this in Lady Jane, the 1986 film starring Helena Bonham Carter. And most recently, in My Lady Jane on Amazon Prime Video, we see their love depicted as something very steamy, very romantic, and ultimately quite successful. But what was the reality? How accurate are these portrayals? In May of 1553, the marriage between Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley took place at Durham House in London. Jane was 16 years old, and it is thought that her husband may have been the same age or possibly a bit older, at about 18 years old. Lady Jane was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk, and his wife, Lady Frances Brandon. So Lady Frances Brandon, Lady Jane's mother, was directly related to the royal family. In fact, her mother was Mary Tudor, the younger sister of Henry VIII. As a result of this, Lady Jane Grey knew that her lineage was very important. She was part of the royal family. In fact, she and her cousin Edward VI, who was the king, were actually educated together as children, and this is a depiction of that. And she was very close to her cousin Edward. So, who was Lady Jane's groom? Well, he was Lord Guildford Dudley, as we see here. He was the younger son of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Guildford's father was incredibly important during this time. He was Lord President of the Council and was essentially the de facto ruler of England from 1550 to 1553. Dudley himself was described by a chronicler as a comely, virtuous and goodly gentleman. But he was not a great match for Lady Jane Grey. She was of royal blood, and I think she expected to have been married very well indeed. And so, allegedly, when this betrothal was mooted, was put forward to Lady Jane Grey, she flatly refused to marry him. She was not, I think, willing to marry a man who would not inherit a title. He wasn't even the eldest son of the Duke of Northumberland, so why on earth was this match even put forward? On top of this, Lady Jane was intelligent, she was studious, she was pious, and there were rumours swirling around Lord Guildford that he was more interested in the more fun pursuits of life, perhaps womanising, hunting, drinking, gambling. Regardless, the two were made to marry because their parents wished it so. By this point in time, it was fairly well known that King Edward VI was likely to die early, so of course he needed to name his successor. According to his father, Henry VIII's will, the crown should have gone to his eldest half-sister, Mary. But Mary was a Catholic, and Edward was a very fervent Protestant, and so he wanted to protect the Protestant country. This made Lady Jane Grey, who was also a Protestant, a viable candidate. His other half-sister, Elizabeth, was also overlooked, although she was a Protestant. This is likely because the parents of Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley wanted them to become the next rulers. Don't forget that Lord Guildford Dudley's father was the most important man in England at this time. And he was a schemer. He was scheming to get his son, via his wife, on the throne of England. So back to May of 1553. They were married in a very, very lavish ceremony indeed. Edward, the king, didn't attend because he was very ill, but he allegedly paid money for all of the wedding clothes, so he approved of the match. It is actually thought that the two did not consummate their marriage on that wedding night. Lady Jane Grey was still considered very young, and so she was returned back to her parents' home. The separation was only of a brief duration, however, and they were soon installed as husband and wife in Durham House, where they consummated the marriage. We don't know whether there was a love at first sight, whether there were any sparks of lust as depicted in these films and TV shows. We don't know how close a bond they formed, and we really don't know if they lived harmoniously or not. But the political situation of the time was rapidly changing. Edward VI soon died, and Jane Grey was named his successor, becoming queen all of a sudden. And so I believe that because these two young people, these two teenagers, were basically thrown into this political spectrum, they must have formed a fast and quick bond. They only really had each other to navigate this difficult situation. We know that Guildford was by his wife's side when his father told her that she had been named Queen of England. He was also by her side as they made their entry into London and then into the Tower of London. This was crucial. He was seen to be supporting her, seen to be supporting the fact that she was queen and that he was her husband. However, it seems as though Guildford had a strong expectation of being named king alongside Jane being named queen. This is, of course, probably what his father had wanted, but Jane was having none of it. Jane said that she would make him a duke, but she would absolutely not make him king unless she was petitioned by Parliament. Guildford was apparently annoyed at this, and he went to his mother to intercede. And in a letter written by Lady Jane herself, Guildford's mother induced her son not to sleep with me anymore. And so that would suggest that they were sharing a bed with one another, and even if they weren't consummating the marriage, they were at least spending time together, and it was seen as a powerful enough bargaining chip to basically remove Guildford from Jane's bed. However, regardless of this statement, the political situation had rapidly changed in England, and Mary had triumphantly come into London and secured the crown for herself. And so now her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, and Lord Guildford Dudley were imprisoned in the Tower of London. They were imprisoned separately, and they were later both found guilty of treason. They were both found guilty of treason, and they were, of course, condemned to death. Lady Jane, however, was offered a chance by Mary, now Queen Mary, to renounce the Protestant faith in favour of Catholicism, and then she would be pardoned. But Lady Jane refused. She was a very staunch Protestant, as we all know. During their imprisonment, it is not thought that they saw one another, and we don't even know whether they were able to share messages. However, we do know that just before their execution, Guildford wished to meet Lady Jane for one last time, supposedly desiring to give her the last kisses and the last embrace. Again, that would suggest that they shared some affection, but perhaps crazily, Lady Jane refused to meet her husband. Because, and this is a quote, their sight would increase the misery in both and bring much more suffering. And this is because Jane believed that once they were dead, and this is a quote, they would live perpetually joined in an indissoluble bond. So Jane thought that their souls would be met and joined forevermore after their execution. And I think that is really romantic. So although their love or lust might not have been quite so steamy as is depicted in film and TV, I think that they did share an affection with one another. And of course they were sharing each other's traumas because they were both to be executed that very day. And on the day of execution, Lady Jane Grey allegedly saw Guildford being led off to his place of execution, and she actually apparently saw his severed remains coming back into the Tower of London, and the reality was so painful that she called out of the window, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford." And what an awful thing to see, what a traumatic thing to witness. After Lady Jane Grey herself was executed, her remains with that of her husband were laid to rest in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula in the Tower of London. Their graves were unmarked. And all of this, their whole marriage, lasted only 9 months. It really is one of the most tragic tales in history. They were both so very young when they were killed, and they weren't killed for their own ambition, they were killed for that of their parents.